Well, the book of James is about living out our faith. James challenges us as believers to be certain that our practice matches our profession, that we don't just claim to know Christ, but you see that in the practice in our day-to-day lives. And we want to be sure that our behavior matches our belief. Someone has said, what you do is what you believe. Everything else is just a bunch of religious talk. You know, when you look at the book of James, it really speaks to our sanctification. That is part of the salvation process. There are three facets or three components to salvation, if you will: justification, sanctification, glorification. And justification, of course, occurs at the moment you accept Christ. When you trust his work on the cross, his blood that was shed in order to justify us with the Father, at that point you become free from the penalty of sin. You're no longer under the wrath and judgment of God, but you are justified. You're made right with God. And then sanctification expresses both who we are and who we are becoming. Sanctification is a position that you have immediately when you come to Christ. You're not only justified, but you're sanctified, but it's also a process. At the moment of salvation, you're sanctified, but you also have to grow in that sanctification. So sanctification is a process that God uses to transform us and conform us to the image of Christ. And in the process of sanctification, we are freed from the power of sin. We have power to be able to overcome temptation and to not give in to sin. And then finally, when we leave this earth, in eternity we'll be glorified. We will receive a glorified body and be free forevermore from the presence of sin. Well, as we come to James today, we're going to be in chapter 1. If you haven't read the book of James, we read it the last couple of weeks in our New Testament reading if you're following along. But if you haven't read the book of James, I would strongly encourage that. It is not difficult. It is not over your head theology. It is very simple and practical truth. And our focal point this morning in chapter 1 is going to be verses 13 through 18, where James addresses temptation. But I want us first to look at a few very basic points from verses 2 through 12 where trials are addressed. James tells us that trials are a part of every believer's life. And God uses those trials to test our faith, to make us stronger, to help us withstand even greater pressure. And when we're in those trials, in the midst of those trials, if we're focused on and trusting the Lord, James tells us we can actually have joy in the midst of those trials because we know that God is using those trials for our benefit. And so three very simple summary statements from James 1, 2 through 12. When we think about trials, we need to focus on three truths. The first is this: God is sovereign. God is sovereign. He is completely in control. Nothing takes him by surprise. No trial you face, no difficulty that comes is not something that he doesn't know about. Secondly, there is good in suffering. James makes that very clear. There is good in suffering. There are things that God will accomplish in the process of our suffering. And then thirdly, trials can assist in the sanctification process. God can use those trials to transform us and make us more and more like Christ. Now, certainly in the midst of trials, sometimes it's difficult to see the purpose God has and know how to respond. And so James tells us when you're in those trials, and perhaps you can't see, you can't understand, he tells us that we are to ask for wisdom from God. And when James is talking about wisdom, he's not talking about philosophical thought. He's talking about understanding and practical skill. God can help us know how to move through and how to grow in the trial that we're facing. Unfortunately, we don't think of that often in the midst of trials, and we try to figure out those challenges on our own. But when we come and ask for wisdom from God, we are acknowledging our dependency on him and also expressing and admitting our inadequacy. And Scripture is very clear that when we come to God, he moves toward us as we depend on him. Look at 121st Psalm, verses 1 and 2. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And so when difficult circumstances come into your life as a believer, those circumstances can strengthen you if you obey God, if you trust him, and if you're confident in his care and in his provision. But that same trial and that same circumstance that can strengthen a fully devoted follower can lead to temptation to do evil, to the one who doubts God and the one who chooses to disobey his word. It is totally up to our response and the response of our heart when we're in trial. That's why James moves immediately in this first chapter. He moves immediately from trials to go on and talk about temptation. And I want us to spend the majority of our focus this morning on verses 14 and 15, but we're also going to look at the verses around that remind us about the nature of God. Let's read together James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So right off the bat, James makes it clear that your temptation is not from God. God cannot be tempted by evil, and God certainly does not tempt anyone. And I mentioned it last week, and I'll say it again this morning. We're tempted and we fall to sin when we doubt. What is it we doubt? Well, we doubt that God can meet our every need. We doubt that God can see us through that difficulty. Our temptation comes when we take our eyes off God and turn it on the circumstance or the things around us. We stop trusting him. We stop trusting his love and his goodness for us. Think back to the first temptation in the garden. When Adam and Eve were tempted, it was because Satan convinced them to not trust in God and his goodness. And Adam and Eve gave in to that sin because they desired to be lords of their own destiny. They didn't want to be under the lordship of God. And so they desired to be under their own destiny and to be in control, to be their own God. And when we're tempted, typically we want something that will bring us more pleasure or give us more fulfillment in our lives than what God provides. And so we deceive ourselves, and we misbelieve what we know is true, and we pervert the truth about God. And that's why we fall to temptation. Well, what is the truth? Look at verses 16 through 18. What is true about God that James has written here? God has all we need for complete fulfillment. He's not holding back on good things, which is what Adam and Eve thought. He hasn't suddenly become evil. He hasn't forgotten us. Our sin is a result of trying to meet our own needs. It's a lack of faith and trust that God will freely give us every good and perfect gift. Verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from God. Every gift from God, everything from God is good and perfect. Even our trials are even a gift. But let's not miss in verse 18 the best gift. This is what confirms for us that every good and perfect gift is from God. In verse 18, he tells us that God made us his by his will and by the power of his word. What does that mean? God saved us. God made us his own. It was his decision. You remember Romans 5:8, in the midst of our sin, he demonstrated his love for us in that Christ died for us. He made us his own. He saved us. Then why would we doubt his goodness? Romans 8:32, Paul expressed it this way, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? We can trust him. If he's willing to sacrifice his own son for our good, we can trust him that he is always working for our good, and every gift from him is good and perfect. And so when trials come, we turn to God, we cling to him, we obey him fully. If we do not do that, we're going to be overcome with temptation. So let's look. What happens when we don't trust? Look at the anatomy of temptation in verses 14 and 15. Verse 14, he says, first of all, that we are lured. In the Greek, it means to be drawn away. It gives the idea that you're going maybe a particular direction and something over here kind of catches your eye and you're drawn to turn toward what is luring you. Now, what does the word lure make you think of? Well, we use a lure to catch a fish. We lure wild game into a trap. We lure animals to their death with attractive bait. And in the same way, you and I are lured by worldly attraction. If you've got an NIV Bible this morning, I like the fact that the NIV doesn't use the word lured. The NIV says that we are dragged away. Picture that in your mind. You're literally taken hold of and dragged away for the kill. He says we are lured. He says we are enticed. That's a parallel to being drawn away, and it is a fishing term. It means to capture or to catch with bait. But notice how we are lured away and enticed. You see that next phrase? By his own desire. We can't blame it on circumstances. We can't blame it on internet or the media. We can't say that we were lured by our friends or by other people. Listen, we can't even say the devil made me do it. We are lured and enticed. We are lured by our own desire. The problem's not out there. The problem is in here. In here. What is desire? Well, the word desire refers to lust. Here's the definition of lust: strong desire of the human soul to acquire or enjoy something to fulfill the flesh. You see, your desires cause you to look at that lure with the intent to act, with the intent to sin. When you look and your desire takes hold, you fully intend to follow through. That's why the Apostle John warned us in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. He said, don't love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world or the things of the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those are the lust. And he says those things are not from God, they're from the world, and those things are passing away, but the one who loves God abides forever. You know what James is literally saying here? We entrap ourselves. We bait our own hook. We put the bait on the hook. And our sinful and rebellious nature finds the thing that is forbidden to be attractive. And why is that? Why is it that what is forbidden, what is sinful, is so attractive? Because sin is attractive. Because sin is pleasurable. I'd be a fool if I stood up here and tried to convince you that there's nothing pleasurable, nothing exciting, nothing attractive about sin. It is. But those forbidden things are also attractive because they're an opportunity for us to assert self-will and self-rule. We're constantly rebelling against the rule of God in our lives. Now, let me say this about temptation. Temptation itself is not a sin. It comes to all of us. Jesus himself was tempted, yet without sin. Temptation is not a sin, and temptation is not always avoidable, especially in the culture that we live in. Many years ago, before I joined a local church staff, I worked for a group called International Evangelism, and I was working in the student ministry division, and I'll never forget the time we had spent several months. We were in the process of writing a new curriculum for student ministry. It was called Growing in Godliness, and it was about moral purity. And about 6 months before we finished that project, 1 block back from our office, which is right on the freeway there in Fort Worth, this huge billboard went up of this woman dressed very seductively. And there was no other way to get to the office but come down that one-way access road. And so every morning, all of us working on that material on moral purity would see this billboard. And I remember having the conversation about it one day, and someone saying, well, it's no surprise considering the work that we're trying to do. But I'll never forget another member of our group saying, well, listen, this is the way I've always heard it. A bird may land in your hair, but you don't have to invite it to build a nest. It's not the temptation that's the sin. Our success or our failure when temptation comes depends on what we decide to do with that temptation. And when we choose to dwell on the tempting thought, it will grow into a lustful desire. And let me just tell you, when it grows to the point of lustful desire, your brain and your conscience shut down. And in the middle of enjoying that lustful desire, you will forget the truth of Scripture. You'll forget the words of Hebrews 11. The pleasures of sin last only a short time. Yes, it is pleasurable. Yes, sin is fun. But the pleasures of sin last only for a season, only for a short time. Verse 15. The desire gives birth to sin, which results in death. You know, sin is not a spontaneous or accidental act. I'll never forget a youth pastor friend of mine telling me once that he had a young couple, a high school couple, come into his office. They'd been great leaders in his group, and they came into his office to confess that they had accidentally crossed the line. Now, I don't want to go into great detail here, but that's not something that is an accident. It's planned. Paul in Romans 13:14 said, make no provision for the flesh. Let me paraphrase that. People don't fall into sin, they plan it. Temptation is a process that gives birth to sin, and along with the sin comes deadly results. Let's look at the progress of temptation. 4 steps. Number 1, a focus on the temptation. Again, the temptation's not the sin, it's when we choose to dwell on and focus on the temptation. That leads to a compelling desire. You turn away, you're lured, you focus, and that compelling desire occurs in you. Next, an overwhelming impulse. The desire completely overtakes you, and it becomes an overwhelming impulse, which leads to what? A foolish action. You didn't intend to do something foolish, but that temptation, that lure caught your attention, became an overwhelming desire. And then an overwhelming impulse leads to sin. And look at the results. What does that lead to when you commit a foolish, sinful action? It leads to shattered lives. It leads to ruin. It leads to brokenness. It leads to separation from God. Those are the consequences you can always expect when you give in to temptation and you sin. It is going to shatter lives, yours and others. It is going to ruin. It is going to lead to brokenness. And for you as a believer, even though your sin does not disqualify you from heaven, you don't lose your salvation, you will experience separation from God even as a believer because your sin has broken fellowship with Him. Now, I've never met anyone who wakes up in the morning and says, I think today I'm going to do whatever I can to ruin my life. That's not what we do. Our life is ruined when we let desire run unchecked and when we follow through on that desire and we plan to sin. And once you've given into temptation, like I said, your brain or conscience shuts down and you're not able to think about the cost of the sin. Sin will always take you farther than you want to go. It will always keep you longer than you want to stay. And it will always cost you more than you want to pay. So what does it mean exactly in verse 15 that sin brings forth death? Well, for the non-believer, for the person without Christ, the person who's never come to Christ to confess their sin nature, receive His forgiveness, it's simple. There's going to be not only separation from God in this life, but eternal death and separation from God in the next life. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death, not physical death, but spiritual death. For the non-believer, sin will keep you separated from God, and if you don't do something about that sin, if you don't receive what Christ has done for you, you will be separated from God for all of eternity. And let me assure you, the worst thing in hell, I don't believe, is the physical torment. I think the worst thing in hell, the most tormenting thing in hell, is recognizing that you were made for a God who loves you and had a purpose for your life, and you chose to do your own thing, go your own way, and now the very thing you were created for, to have a relationship with God, you will never be able to have. What does it mean that sin brings forth death to the believer? And that's who James is writing to here. James is writing to believers, those who trusted Christ in His sacrificial death and received forgiveness. What does it mean for the believer? Well, sin can't separate you from God. It doesn't end your relationship with God. So how does it bring death? Well, for the believer, when you're in sin, the death is not typically physical, although we'll all die one day because of our sin nature. But the death he's talking about here is not necessarily physical, although it could be. Don't forget Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira. Their deceit, God took their lives for that. But it's not necessarily physical. It is more like, as a believer, when you are in sin, you are in a death-like existence. You are like a person who's without Christ. Why? Because sin breaks your fellowship with God. Sin ruins your witness. It robs your joy. It brings death to relationships and to your integrity and to inner peace. You're the walking dead. if you're a believer who's living in sin. As we look at what James is laying out for us here in verses 14, the anatomy of temptation, as we read what James is saying here, I think you've probably already got this. There's a great picture that comes to mind that may help us understand and learn how to short-circuit the process of temptation. Look again at the process he lays out. You're lured. Your attention is diverted by your own desire to do evil. You're enticed. You're drawn into a trap. You're captured. Sin is born. Sin brings forth death. Now, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but the picture is a lot like fishing. And let's specifically maybe say fly fishing. I'm not a fly fisherman, but I've talked to men in our church who are fly fishermen and learned a few things. Fly fishermen, many of them, you can go to the store and buy flies. Many of them make their own flies. They tie their own flies. They design them based on what they're hoping to catch. And different flies are used in different times and conditions, the weather, the water. And if you've ever seen a fly, they're very, very small. But they're attractive. And they're deadly. And that is a picture of how Satan will tempt you. He has your desires in mind. He knows what will trip you up. He knows what will attract your attention. He knows how to approach you. He knows that there are conditions and times in your life when you may be more vulnerable to the lure he's going to throw out there. And the tempting bait will seem small. It will seem like not a big deal. But once that hook is set, a fly fisherman, you've probably seen it on television or in a movie, or if you haven't seen it in person, a fly fisherman is just constantly over and over and over again casting that bait. It's very repetitive. And the reason for that is every time that fly hits the water, he's hoping that it will catch the attention of a fish and cause that fish to turn aside. Maybe even in the peripheral vision of a fish, it sees that fly hitting the water, but a fly fisherman is continually working the bait over and over and over. And a good fisherman knows how to bait, knows how to approach, and those fish don't stand a chance. Let me ask you a question this morning. Do you think you stand a chance against Satan? His schemes, his plan, his design to destroy you, do you think you stand a chance against Satan? Not apart from Christ, you don't. And he's not going to give up. So if the picture of a fish getting hooked is a good analogy of temptation, you know what we need to do this morning? We need to think like fish. I don't know if fish even have a brain. They may not think. I don't know. But if we could think like fish, we might be able to figure out how to short circuit this process of temptation. If fish could talk, I think there are 4 things they would say to each other. Number 1, stay together. Stay in the school. Stay in the group. Pastor Brad, a couple of weeks ago in Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, reminded us as believers that we're to gather together faithfully and regularly. We're to encourage each other. 2 Timothy 2:22, Paul told Timothy, flee youthful lust, listen to the rest of the verse, and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, listen, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. What are we saying here? Well, you need to remember you're a fish. You belong in the lake or the pond with other fish, and there's safety together. We're better together. Yes, when we gather here on Sundays. Yes, when we're in Bible studies together, but also during the week. Calling each other, checking on each other, texting each other. We need to be talking to each other as we're together. We're swimming along in the school, and there's some enticement over here. Somebody else, as I'm beginning to look, needs to say, hey, you need to watch out. That's not what it seems. Hey, don't look over there. Stay with us. Second thing I think fish would remind each other is the purpose or the need to stay alert and stay focused. The bait never goes away. Satan is casting and casting and casting. The only way to keep our focus off the bait is to keep our focus on Jesus. Your focus determines your future. You familiar with the moth effect? What happens when you turn on the porch light? Moths and bugs are drawn to it, right? You know, because of the moth effect, many people in law enforcement, if they stop a car on the side of the highway, they will go to the passenger side of the car because a lot of officers have been injured and killed standing on the driver's side of the car because when you're going down the interstate and you see something off on the shoulder, where do your eyes go? Yes, and as your eyes go that way, you tend to drift that way as well. Got to keep our focus on Jesus. Stay together. Stay alert, stay focused. Number 3, this is going to be a tough one for you. Stop faking. Sometimes you're going to get hooked. Everyone gets ensnared from time to time. Just because you get hooked doesn't mean you have to end up in the boat and ultimately in the frying pan. Jesus wants to help you remove the hook. You need to stop playing with it and do whatever it takes. How ridiculous that when you're caught up in sin, you don't go to Jesus with it as if you think he doesn't know. He knows everything. He knows your thoughts. He knows your words before you speak them. So why are you hiding from him? But you know what we do? We get caught up in sin and we just try to pretend everything's okay. And can I show you how ridiculous that looks? How you doing? Yeah. Oh, I'm great. Oh, God is blessing me. Oh, yeah. No, I'm fine. Everything's great. That's what you look like when you're caught up in sin. Oh, it may not be evident to everybody in the room, but I will guarantee you, you can't hide it for very long. And so we need to stop faking. We need to seek out accountability. In James chapter 5, verse 16, he says, we are to confess our sins to God, yes. That's not what he says, though. Confess your sins to one another. Pray for one another. Oh, can you just confess your sin to God and be good and forgive? Yes, but there's something about confessing to one. You know, I have figured out in my own life the times that I am strongest about turning away from sin is when I'm tempted to sin, and if that sin was found out, it would be horribly embarrassing. Sometimes it takes some pain to make us turn away from sin. Sometimes we need to be embarrassed, having to confess that to one another. Paul in Galatians 6, 1 and 2 says, if you see a brother caught in sin, restore him. That's what we're supposed to be about. You know, we talked several weeks ago, back in August, of we don't have to come in here acting like everything's okay, everything's fine. We're all struggling. It's okay. The church is for struggling people, not perfect people. Why do we come in here and walk around with the lure hanging out of our mouth, clipped to our lip, and act like everything's fine? No, we're to pray for one another. We're to help one another. We're to encourage one another. Fourth, we need to speak what is true to each other and to ourselves. What do I mean by that? Look back at verse 16 and 17. Don't be deceived. What does that mean? Don't think inconsistently. You need to remind yourself that God does care. God's not holding back. God's not keeping you from your best interest. And then verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from the Father. Sin is an attempt to meet our own needs because we don't believe that God has every good and perfect gift for us. It's a lack of faith and a lack of trust. Application is pretty simple this morning. How do we avoid giving into temptation? Well, first of all, we trust God for our needs. When that temptation comes, we need to stop and think about what we're tempted to do and what we think it will do for us and recognize that God has everything we need. Then we need to do life together. Not just gather in here and sit in a room together, but do life together. Encourage each other, hold each other accountable. We need to think biblically. We need to stay focused and alert because Satan is not going to stop. He's going to continually be throwing the bait out. And when we're tempted, the desire to be our own God is a big part of that temptation to determine our own destiny. When we're tempted, we have to surrender to Jesus instead of the temptation. You know what temptation is? It's another opportunity to tell God that you love him. God, I love you. I choose you. I choose your way. Let me close with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his work on temptation. Look at this with me. In our members, there is a slumbering inclination towards desire, which is both sudden and fierce. We have to recognize it's there. With irresistible power, desire seizes mastery over the flesh. All at once, a secret smoldering fire is kindled. The flesh burns. It is in flames. It makes no difference whether it's sexual desire, ambition, or vanity, or desire for revenge, or love of fame and power, or greed for money. Look at this last statement here. At this moment, God is quite unreal to us. He loses all reality, and only desire for the creature is real. The powers of clear discrimination and a decision are taken from us. We can't let it get that far. We have to stay together, stay focused, be accountable to each other, confess our sins to each other. The sanctification that occurs in your life and mine doesn't happen apart from some very strategic and significant decisions that we need to make. And those decisions are best made with the help of someone else in our school of fish.